So we'll start in a different way here. I'll start asking a question. And my question is not for Dan, but it's for you. What is the place in the world that comes to your mind when you think about innovation? What's the location that comes to your mind? Someone, what did I hear? Israel. What? Silicon Valley. Okay, great point. So we're not talking Silicon Valley, but we start with Silicon Valley, right? The concept for this conversation, really, it came up from one of our partners here. I think that Juan Pedro is not here in the moment. But when we were engineering this conference, the Global Innovation Summit, Juan Pedro came to us and said, hey, we should really talk about the things that we have, the difficulties that we face in different emerging innovation ecosystems around the globe. So we'll be talking geographies, challenges, and opportunities, and what's coming maybe from some of the unusual suspects from around the globe. But we will actually start with Silicon Valley. And I think that a lot of people, we heard that, think about, hey, Silicon Valley is the innovation hotspot. But when we talk about geographies, also there are things that are emerging in the United States outside of Silicon Valley. When Deborah Chad hosted 2 years ago, the National Competitiveness Forum, we had Steve Case talking about the rise of the rest in the United States. And you, John, you've been living in Silicon Valley. You were in the East Coast before. You've been seeing that transformation across the United States. What's rising and what's driving the emergence of new innovation geographies within the largest innovative economy in the globe? And what can we learn from that?
Well, first of all, Roberto, thank you for having me. I've lived and worked in Silicon Valley for the last 40 years. Large companies, small companies, started and invested in several companies. Some of these have succeeded, some of them have failed. So I've had a good exposure to all aspects of Silicon Valley over the last 40 years. Silicon Valley has tremendous momentum, and it's not going anywhere. It's not going to disappear from the face of the earth, that's for sure. If anything, it will continue to get stronger, I think, thanks to its momentum. However, there is a really interesting and significant trend which is happening in the two counties of California which are most closely associated with Silicon Valley, namely Santa Clara and San Mateo. And that is, I think for the first time ever, more native professionals, i.e. non-immigrant professionals, are leaving these two counties than coming into it. If you look at the immigrant flow, it's roughly constant and continues roughly constant. But if you look at the folks who are Native Americans, native U.S. citizens, they are leaving. And in particular, they're going to Texas. So why is that? And what is it that makes Texas more attractive to these professionals than Silicon Valley? Well, a number of things. One is Texas is one of only 7 states in the U.S. that has no state tax, whereas California has one of the highest, marginal tax rate of 13.3%. It will be even higher effectively under this new tax law that was just passed in December for 2018 for the first time, because state taxes won't be deductible from federal taxes as they have been in prior years. So a more attractive tax environment is one factor. A lower cost of living is another factor. The average cost of a home in Texas is $250,000. In Silicon Valley, it's $450,000. A lighter regulatory environment, making it easier to hire people and start your own business, and a lower cost workforce, in spite of the fact that unemployment is lower in Texas than it is in California. So for all of these reasons, it may be that rather than thinking about creating Silicon Valleys in our respective countries, we should be thinking about creating Texases in our countries, or talking about How can we create a Texas in our country? I think something that's really important is a country's or states or provinces' relative ease of doing business relative to other countries or other states or other provinces. And so a metric that I hark to again and again is the World Bank Ease of Doing Business Index. Where does a country rank on that index? It's a composite, as you know, of 10 or 12 different measures. How easy is it to start a business, to get electricity, to get title to property, to get credit, and so forth. And something I say is that for any country in the world, no matter where you rank on the World Bank Ease of Doing Business Index, an achievable, measurable, and aggressive goal that will benefit everyone in your country is to cut your rank in half in the next 5 years. The United States is currently at number 6. Sadly, we've declined from 3 when the index was first created in 2005 to 7 last year and 6 this year. The only reason we're at 6 rather than 7 is because the UK got more worse than the United States did over the last year, and so we switched places. But a very good goal for the US would be to cut our rank back down to 3, and a long-term goal for any country would be to rank number 1 on that index. If you're a state or a province rather than a country, the World Bank is very willing to work with you to develop a similar set of metrics for your state or province. There's also within the US, there's the Cato Freedom of the 50 States Index, which has broadly similar criteria for the individual states as compared to countries. So those are some ideas on this question of what's happening within the U.S.
So what we're saying is that there are new regions emerging. For sure, there's an abundance of talent in the United States and a lot of mobility. I think that's an important component to taking place. But if I heard well, John, what you are really doing here is to make the case for the basics of competitiveness, right? A smooth business environment. I come from an emerging nation. And sometimes you have a lot of friction. You dissipate energy, creating heat and not light. So if I read well, you see that that's a foundation for that. Yeah, good point. But once again, related to, let's say you're connecting with Silicon Valley. Saif, you lived there, you were at Stanford, you were top global researcher on aeronautics and aerospace, not just working in Silicon Valley, but also in Europe. And now you are leading an initiative in your home country, Oman, that it's an emerging nation in the sense that institutions and innovation ecosystems needs to be built. How hard is that? What are the real issues that you are facing?
Thank you very much, Roberto. I think, in my opinion, first, innovation is really cannot be copied, but there are really fundamental requirements for an innovative place or a site to evolve. So really many places they try to copy Silicon Valley but failed. I think, in my opinion, innovation is like plant. It has its own environment and its own ecosystem, and it has to grow and evolve naturally using the local resources and local environment. Well, I came from Oman. I mean, I think from Oman, many of you is a relatively small country located in the southern east part of the Arabian Peninsula, bordered by Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, and of course we have a long coastline which is basically facing the Arabian Sea, Indian Ocean. The nation of Oman has been there, I mean, since 10,000 years, and it has been also known as an innovative country because of needs and challenges. I mean, the area is really arid area. So Omanis, since 4,000 years, they innovated a new water irrigation system, which we call them aflaj. And this aflaj is simply really a channel of water that goes for several kilometers under the ground with vertical wells, actually, to allow this channel to be surfaced from time to time. But this is what created really a sustainable civilization in that part of the world, is basically this water system. The channel itself, the water channel itself, is not really the key innovation, but the system around this water channel is really what created the impact and the sustainable, peaceful environment in that part of the region, where actually the water is treated as a commodity. You can actually buy, sell, and rent your share of water, and you can inherit your part of water, and it's efficiently utilized for the purpose of growth and sustainability in that part. So building on that historic, trends of innovation in Oman, and leveraging on the strategic location where Oman is really becoming a hub for logistics. 30% of crude oil export is passing through Strait of Hormuz, which is controlled of Oman, and also 1/3 of the gas supply is going through that Hormuz Strait. Is that the evolvement of the modern Oman? Modern Oman is coming out very rapidly, starting actually the education system in Oman has evolved very well. And recently, of course, the country established the Research Council and mandated with fostering research and innovation at the national level. The Research Council, of course, it's through transient phase of basically creating an ecosystem for innovation. So we started really by having a national research strategy and a national innovation strategy. Both these strategies are actually trying to work out building the human capital, building capacity at the national level, also putting system for technology transfer, also actually putting system for or orienting research toward the national needs, and also allowing us to build connectivity and connection between the higher education, industry, and the government, the triple helix concept. And that is through development of science parks. And that's actually maybe one of the similarities. We are trying to mimic what's going on around the world. So science parks in Oman is trying to foster the three triple helix concepts, where actually we're trying to bring industry closer to the academia and trying to create the innovation ecology around that. It's not easy. It requires really the right skills and the right human capacity and the right communication mechanism and the right environment in order really to create that engine for innovation. But I am sure if you really put these right elements there, it will really flourish with time, especially if there is a sustainability and push with a clear plan in moving forward along that direction.
Great. Building on your ecosystem metaphor, right? There are different dimensions to be addressed, and they're all connected: capital, talent, business structures, the legal environment, etc. If you had to choose one, or I could rephrase this, if you had to think on the bottleneck, that weakest link that you have at this very time, that if you change that could really unleash the development of the ecosystem at this time, what would that link be in your case?
I think integration. Integration is really, and the fostering this linkage between the different players of innovations is really a key important. Otherwise, this loop of the process for innovation development will be broken, and it will not really evolve and flourish very efficiently. So really integration between the different components of innovation, whether that is in the academic or finance or basically the technology transfer or IP. So all these elements has to work really efficiently and coherently together in order. So I go back to integration for that.
Okay, and in a minute I'll ask you what you are doing to address that. But before doing, I want to turn to you, Tanya. When Deborah moderated was in the first conversation, you mentioned that there are lots of Greek entrepreneurs, business leaders, university presidents all over the globe. I have a good friend. She's the chief scientist. She's from Greek, postdoc from Harvard, chief scientist of one of the most trendy biotech startups in San Francisco. And why she's not in Athens, Greece? Why does she need to go to San Francisco to build and grow her company?
Right. I think, okay, one point very related to what you just said. In 2016, the number one Greek export, valued at 12.9 billion euros, was human capital. So since the beginning of the crisis, about 350,000, mainly young and mainly skilled people, have left the country in search of opportunities and education elsewhere. And that creates sort of a double-edged sword, in a sense, for the country, because now we're at this critical point where we really need to usher in a new era of growth. And in the current sort of context with digital transformation and the opportunities offered, and with the need to bring innovation into our ecosystem, a crucial element of that is bringing in that human talent back to the country. And so, you know, other geographies like Silicon Valley are probably having the conversation, how do we attract the best talent from all over the world? We're having the conversation, how do we bring back the people that left? So in order to have an innovation ecosystem, you need those people, but in order for those people to come, they need to understand that there is something happening, that there is an innovation ecosystem forming. And there are multiple factors that influence that beyond talent, of course. I mean, you referred to the ease of doing business in the business environment, and that's a huge problem in Greece. Considering also the macroeconomic issues over the last few years and sort of an unstable tax regime, the difficulties and the bureaucracy involved with running and closing a business, that sort of kind of functions as a deterrent. But I'm not going to focus on the policy side of it because I'm here to sort of talk about a more private sector, business-focused perspective. And I'm going to go back to something that you said about networks and links. So there's that importance of having these research networks and of making sure that we have these cross-cutting collaborations, but there's also the element that you need this research to translate into commercial venture. And in terms of knowledge flows, beyond technology and science, you also need to have the entrepreneurial skills and knowledge that help young entrepreneurs or researchers sort of create a vehicle that would bring that into the market and diffuse this innovation, I guess, and also usher in growth and more inclusive growth. So for me, SMEs are crucial in that. And beyond the fact that they're weakly connected in Greece and that you don't see a lot of collaboration between research and industry and between researchers, there's also the question that's kind of hovering over everyone's head, which is finance. Sort of how do we finance innovation? And in Greece, there has been a lot of issues with access to finance. It's been very lacking. There wasn't really a VC ecosystem until very recently. Now we're seeing some signs and some movement with that, which is encouraging. But I think that for that to be sustainable, you also need to make sure that the whole capital market ecosystem is working for the companies and that the companies have the skills that they need and the knowledge of how to utilize that and what's more appropriate for them. So coming from the stock exchange on our part, I think we're seeing this imperative now to more dynamically enter into this process of supporting innovative SMEs, helping them access finance. And we're trying to do this now with a new program called Roots, which is essentially aiming to increase awareness and knowledge of what financing tools exist so that SMEs don't rely that much on credit and debt, because debt finance obviously is not the most appropriate form of finance for innovation, because innovation is inherently risky. And banks in Southern Europe right now are not taking on any risk. And the companies don't know how to access the capital market. And particularly with stock exchanges, it sort of seems like this very far off, scary thing, but the tools are there. Like internally, we have these junior markets that have lower sort of listing requirements and work for companies of that size, companies that are innovative, and help them finance their R&D. But we identified that they lack the knowledge and the skills, and they lack these connections. So now through this program, we're trying to select innovative proposals by SMEs to give them the advice and support that they need to sort of build really strong business plans and appropriate financial plans, and to sort of try and see what the best tool for them to finance their growth is. And of course, connect them with the investors and the advisors to make that happen. And I think that what we're hoping with that is that this will also kind of signal that something is happening and attract more people to come back and attract more people to start ventures, and give an incentive for people who are in research to think about how they can commercialize their research. So I think that if I can close on one thing, it's that if we're going to support innovation, we also need to offer innovative services. So it's not just talking about it, it's about sort of changing the mandate of our organizations. Because, for the stock exchange, it's not our traditional mandate to mentor and educate companies. But we identified that that was a sort of an issue in our ecosystem, and we are making a bold move in that direction to try and do our part.
What's great, because you're also building your future pipeline.
Exactly.
Right? And you touched up on the talent thing. I want to turn to you and Ken. But before that, I want a quick question for you yet, Tanya. You were in London before going back to Greece. Why have you decided to return?
I've had that question asked by every single person since the day I moved to Athens. I think it was sort of a choice of seeing the crisis as an opportunity for something new, an opportunity to do things differently, and an opportunity to, I guess, learn much more and do much more with much more impact. At least that's what I tell myself. So.
I think it's a wonderful answer. Yeah, it's like flipping the thing. And Ken, when we finish this day, let's say in 24 hours, we will have 230,000 new inhabitants in this planet. 36% of them will come from Africa, our net gain in terms of population. That's a huge potential. And for sure, we have smart people all across geographies. We're talking geographies. But we don't have opportunities evenly distributed. How will we train and prepare people really to seize opportunities and to build their economies and drive innovation in Africa? What's being done there?
All right. Thank you. And thanks to Barbara and the organizing team as well for inviting me to be part of this panel. It's very obvious that I'm the only face that looks like this in this hall for a reason, right? First, Africa is not a country. So when talking about Africa, the challenge is to deal with the nuances and the variations from the north to the south, from the east to the west, the cultural variations, the different countries, about 54 countries. And those countries have their own legacies and institutions and cultures. And so just a little backdrop here. The peculiar thing with Africa is that when most of the countries got independence, a country like Cameroon, for example, where I come from originally, there was just about 3% literacy in 1960. 3% literacy. And so most of those governments, their priorities were essentially to build the bureaucracies to run their countries and then kind of reclaim what they had lost as their humanity from the colonial period. And they've exceedingly succeeded in that area. With huge bureaucracies, the university system extremely bloated. And the challenge is that the countries now have is what they were facing in the 60s is not there anymore. In this era, they've come to realize that the future of humanity is increasingly Africa. For example, you gave numbers about how many newborns are African. Well, UNICEF says it. So by 2050, there will be about 2.2 more human beings on Earth. Half will be African. Half of that population increase will be African. 1/4 of global population will be African by 2050. And a country like Nigeria alone would be about 8%. So the demographic shift is favoring them tremendously. And that youth potential, that youth bulge is what they're hoping now to tap onto. So after not investing significantly in the sciences because they were worried, concerned about bureaucracies and humanities, in the last 4 years, African countries collectively have invested over $500 million to renew their higher education systems, to create centers of excellences around different university campuses in different countries that would serve as nucleus, sort of nascent points for their own innovation ecosystems. And so you have solutions already that are coming out from these centers that are helping address things like infectious diseases. The Ebola crisis, for example, if it was contained only from within a few West African countries, It was because one of the centers of excellences provided the solutions to address that. Africa actually has its own innovation summit that works to bring out the activities that are going on within the continent from different angles and expose them. I didn't feel like going through the whole list of them, but there are hundreds of different innovation ideas and prototypes that are coming out of these clusters of centers of excellence and the regular non-academic sector. Now, again, there's variation, but some countries especially stand out at that level. A country like Rwanda, where they're not oil rich, they're not natural resource rich, but they've positioned themselves in terms of things like regulations, where now it takes about 2 days to start a business and be up and running. A country like Senegal that has found that one of the ways to pull back their diasporas like us, as you're asking, is to actually create a city, a knowledge city, that would attract the diasporas and provide them the kind of services that they will have in the West, where they are. So, across the continent, there is strong optimism and increasing investment in creating the kind of atmosphere that would make people like me go back, that would bring the over 400 African companies that gross over 1 billion a year into contact with higher education. I mean, over 400 companies that go over 1 billion.
As of today,
Yes.
400 companies have a revenue over 1 billion US dollars.
African companies that they are working to get them interfaced with these centers of excellence so that they address the problems of those industries. So that the things that we're discussing around here that are almost familiar in the northern countries, frontier science and innovation, they're seeing that in the next, well, maybe not the next 5 or 10 years, but in the medium term, Africa should be the playground where these things find not only product utility, but a source of the solutions that will address their own problems. So, someone like me, I can appreciate the challenges that when one looks at Africa, they will think that, maybe Sudan is at war, maybe one country has a problem here, but historically, those challenges have gone down to a minimum in the last 50 years, purposefully. The African Union itself has integrated the continent so that they have a free trade zone. It means all of Africa, with that 40% of the world population, will be one market. No passport across. And companies can work across borders as they want, almost mimicking the Schengen system. And so the potential for Africa is very strong. The talent pool, the basic sciences out of which to pull the technology and the talent pool is still to grow. But the potential and the elements and the awareness of what has to be done, the kind of partnerships that have to be put in place, are obviously there in place. And we're very optimistic about Africa.
2 short questions here. One personal. What would make you go back? Very quick.
What would make me go back?
Yeah, what's the value proposition to take you back to Africa?
Something that actually making me consider go back is the fact that there's a team of African scientists like myself and governments that are working to create a light source, a synchrotron in Africa in the short term. That will provide the atmosphere for the kind of research that I want to do.
Infrastructure.
Infrastructure.
Critical infrastructure for research. And back to one of the things that Scythe, John, and you have touched upon, the ecosystem, different elements here, but really trying to go into some of the details, and I'll tell you why. You talked about innovation centers. How do they work? Are those private sector owned? Are those government owned? What's the mandate and what's the freedom that they have to engage, to sign contracts with industry? Because really the devil lies in the details. You talked about going around, let's say, legacy infrastructures and legacy regulations. So if you could be very short, how do they work?
How do they work? It so happens that most African universities are dominated by the public sector. The government runs them. But the very structure of these centers were meant to give them autonomy. They are like autonomous centers working within the university system. So there were competitive bids where research PIs, project investigators, put up bids, and the regulatory environment the fiduciary requirements were that they have complete autonomy from the government. The government loans the money more like our centers in the US, where the government puts up the resources, but then they are run autonomously within the university system.
I'll go back to you. And a different perspective. You were based in London, UK, a major financial services, creativity, industry, business, wherever center in the globe. But you have lived around the globe. You've lived in South America, right? Really kickstarting innovation programs, innovation processes. What are the differences? And what is needed? What do you see as things that need to be tweaked or built in order to create some of the elements of those ecosystems that we talked about here?
Thank you, Roberto, and thank you again to GFCC and Excellencia for the invitation. It's great to be here. I wanted to start, first of all, by reflecting on just how hard it is to be successful with innovation. In the UK, on average, 1 in 10 companies will survive the first 2 years of trading, and only 1 in 10 of those, so 1 in 100, will achieve any kind of scale. So this stuff is really hard. And so I've been an entrepreneur, and I now also run a startup accelerator based at a university in London, King's College London. And I've learned that there's a combination of art and science to effective innovation. And I particularly wanted to talk about 4 different topics. The first, finance. Second, people. Third, culture. And fourth, something that we haven't talked about so much over the last couple of days, but I think is so fundamental, which is diversity and inclusion. So first of all, to talk about what it was like in Colombia. So 4 years ago, I moved out to Bogota to help found a startup called Co-School. And it was an extraordinary place to be. I'm sure many of you know the history in Colombia and the end of the devastating 50-year civil war there. And what we're seeing now is this great business optimism, lots of Colombians who formerly were living abroad coming back and bringing their money and investment back into the country, a real appetite and engagement from the government to invest in both education and innovation. And also this great opportunity, particularly for first movers in markets like education, like health, to reflect on and learn from innovations that already exist from across the world and to employ them in Colombia. But in our startup, one of the big challenges we had was access to capital. One day we went to the bank to ask for a line of credit, and we were expected to have $20,000 on average in our bank account at any one time. But in a growing startup, that's nigh on impossible. If 20 grand comes into your account, it probably leaves your account about an hour later because you've got a lot of bills to pay. So thinking about some of the models I've seen across the world that I think are particularly impressive. In the UK, we have something called the Seed Enterprise Investment Scheme and the Enterprise Investment Scheme, which is basically a tax incentive for those people looking to put their money into early stage innovation, which effectively means if I give you £100 for your startup or £100,000 for your startup, it actually costs me about £50,000. So it's a really effective means of risk capital to stimulate some of these early stage ideas. The second is a model that we're actually developing at King's College London, which is zero coupon loans. We have the privilege of having access to some very generous alumni from the university who have given us grant money to support some of our early stage companies. We've decided to take an attitude that we want these grants to be repayable based on certain conditions. So for example, if those startups go on to raise Series A funding, they'll be expected to pay that money back. So it is low risk capital for these startups, but also creates some level of sustainability across our portfolio of financing. Next, to move on to people. I'm sure we'd all agree that having great people in a startup or any company is so tantamount to its success. There's a couple of countries that I think are doing things really interesting things. The first is Estonia, that recently rolled out a digital passport to encourage more talented entrepreneurs to come and operate in their country. The second is Startup Chile, a program many of you will have come across, where the government gives out £40,000 in funding plus visas for people to bring their startup companies to Chile. But associated to that in terms of people is to see innovation not just as the development of new technologies and companies, but I would actually argue one of the best opportunities to develop talented people. And those people might go on to become careerist entrepreneurs, but also if they have the opportunity to work on innovative projects, they learn this exceptional toolkit and skill set to become innovators in social enterprise, in government, in the private sector. And it's this extraordinary opportunity to develop those skills in people. The third is about culture. And I was joking with someone yesterday when I said that success in my job is working myself out of a job. And by that, I mean creating an environment of creativity and mutual support and coaching in which entrepreneurs and innovators can learn from each other and motivate each other to continue to succeed. Some of the models we've used might surprise you. We've employed improv comedians to come and run sessions about how to take risks and breaking through barriers and creative thinking. We have set up Spotify playlists to create a culture and identity of sharing music together. And we give out badges to our entrepreneurs to reward progress. So we have this constant sense of intercompetition and gamification to drive a culture of ambition and progress across our startup. Now finally, about diversity and inclusion. This is such an important topic. I'm sure we'd all agree. Last year, it was reported that I think 6% of all venture capital funding went to female founders, but only recently the Boston Consulting Group have released a report to show that while careerist entrepreneurs, the female entrepreneurs receive on average £1 million less funding across their entire careers, they actually generate more revenue. So the facts are really clear that diversity is not just a box-ticking exercise. It's not something we should be doing for social reasons, for moral reasons, ethical reasons. It's actually fundamental to the success of innovation itself. But diversity is much broader than just about gender equality. I'd like to also talk about the importance of supporting those people for whom, for financial reasons, they cannot become entrepreneurs. In the UK, typically an entrepreneur has access to about £30,000 in capital from personal savings, friends, family, etc. For some people, that is just completely impossible. So at King's, we're really proud to have set up a grant fund for those people from lower income backgrounds to be able to take that decision to become an entrepreneur, to take that leap, take that bigger risk and become an entrepreneur. So to close, I want to particularly reflect on, even if I open by saying how difficult innovation is to succeed, how there's so much more inherent in innovation programs and support that goes much more beyond just developing new companies and technologies, but developing the people and leaders for the future. Thanks.
Thank you, Ed. We'll have Eloisa in the next session, who comes from Brazil, and it happens for me to come from Brazil. And just want to mention one thing here. The global average for immigrants across countries in population is 3.5%. In the United States, 13.5% of everybody who lived there were born outside of the United States. In a country like Brazil, 0.3%. So just think about diversity and finding connections and opportunities globally. I think it's very important. The other thing that we talked the other day, and we'll see if we have time to come back, is hard work, the types of places that entrepreneurs go. Yeah, but John, Ed just brought the money to the equation. You as an investor, what's needed across geographies? If you look at opportunities, if you look at entrepreneurs, what do you look for in order to invest in innovative businesses?
What do I look for in an entrepreneur? Well, I have a bias. I think every investor probably has their own methodology and way of thinking about what makes for a good investment. Something that weighs very heavily in my mind is a clear, unsatisfied customer need that the entrepreneur is addressing. I like to say I started my first company with a really cool technology for which there was no market need. And it took me 6 to 9 months to let go of that idea and swap it for something for which there was a real market need, namely the ability to do surveys on the internet. That company is part of Google today. So it really is a worthwhile discipline. It seems to me, start with the customer need and then worry about what's the best technology to apply to address that need. So that's even apart from the entrepreneur and his or her track record and qualifications and so forth. That's what I listen for, and I find I don't get interested in whatever it is they're telling me, no matter what their background and qualifications are, until I hear that real unsatisfied customer need, and I'm persuaded that it's a real unsatisfied customer need. Then, of course, I look at, what have they accomplished so far, either in this venture or in previous ventures, but in particular in this venture. How far have they come on what level of resources? The further they've come on limited resources, the more impressive. That is an indication that they'll be able to apply and do good things with the additional capital that's provided. Other factors like or parts of that are the completeness of the team, whether they've attracted other investors, credible investors, whether they have revenue. I like to say that a really good time to approach an investor is right before and after you either significantly reduce risk from the investor standpoint or significantly increase upside potential. And every time you reach a milestone, like your first profitable quarter or your first paying customer or a working prototype, you've reduced risk from the investor standpoint. Or if you can demonstrate that you've been able to attract your first customer in a market segment that's over and above the initial one that you were focused on, that can indicate upside potential.
Great.
Anyway, those are a few thoughts.
Great. And this, if you, Seth, could have expertise like John, Ed, and yourself from around the globe, how could you use that to leverage your own ecosystem? And this is, I will also ask to you, Tanya, I think this is connected to Roots and you and Ken. How this global connection between emerging ecosystems and global innovation ecosystems, what's the case? We have like 2 minutes, but we need to be fast.
Well, I think this learning is really a very important aspect, of really pushing innovation to go forward. So failure is really a very powerful learning tool. So leveraging on experience and failed attempts, basically to create a market from innovation, is really a key driver to success. So, in my opinion, expertise and network around the globe, especially we are really living in the era of the fourth industrial revolution, where connectivity is really available and abundant. So, I think that network of expertise, if it can be really brought together through the cyberspace, it will really help lots of nations, especially those who are evolving and trying, like in Oman, for example, to come forward with innovation. So I think expertise is really, and those with experience like John and those who have practiced innovation, really and walked the talk, and really they are going to be the one who's going to be teaching those young entrepreneurs who would like really to, pursue the way forward in a very challenging, environment for innovation is really very challenging, and failure has to be there in order really to improve the process and evolve again.
Tanya, what's the secret to do that in practice, to do that connection and make it happen?
I think it's to focus on complementarity and to focus on like knowledge flows and to help build an understanding of what it is that you can give and what it is that others want in the case of the entrepreneur and the investor. So unless you have exposure to what's happening all over the world, to best practices, to sort of different points of view, because innovation is an interactive process. Baseline, this won't work. So yeah.
Clear value propositions and understanding. Okay. And Ken, very quick, how could you leverage global connections to drive innovation?
Of course, no country actually. The notion of nation states now is very nominal, given how things are really globalized, and it's one village now. So no one can isolate themselves that much anymore. The developing countries, especially African countries, they cannot but integrate some of the activities with the northern countries.
How do you do that in practice?
How do you do that in practice? Well, part of why I'm here. There are platforms for innovation and collaboration that exist. There's travel and exchange of activities. Maybe this forum should hold once in Africa. They will have a clear sense of what is happening in the global space. Maybe the African Forum might one day have the GFCC be part of the agenda. It takes interaction like that.
Okay, a final round, very quick. The question of this panel. What's something new? What's an innovation coming from Greece, Oman, something in Africa? Something that you saw maybe outside of London and that you saw, John, in an unsuspected journey. Wants to go first? Very quick. Tanya.
I mean, I'm biased, so I'm just going to say institutions that traditionally have operated in very fixed ways, doing entirely new things, like we're doing at the stock exchange, like what's happening with the VC ecosystem in Greece, and what's happening with the universities who are now waking up and setting up technology transfer offices and knowledge transfer offices. So I would say it's probably that for us.
I think those who are really can capture ideas and aggressive and really pursuing those ideas and be first in the market, they are going to be the one who's going to be there first in the innovation competition.
I mentioned research centers. Those centers by themselves are innovating the university systems in Africa, and there are over 50 of them. And at their own level of research, I know many examples. One of them is one that is innovating in drug delivery for cancer therapy in Abuja in Nigeria. So there are many such examples.
John, something new that's coming that caught your attention.
I invested in a natural language processing company that was basically a spin out from Gdansk Polytechnic Institute in Poland, where there's a real concentration of NLP knowledge and capability. This company incorporated their headquarters in the U.S. under Delaware law, but they retained their software development team in Gdansk.
Ed, very quick, something that you saw, wow, this is innovation coming from an unusual place.
One of the most successful startups we've worked with at King's College London is called See the Signs, founded by two hospital doctors who have found the most basic application for effective algorithms that I've come across and the most impactful, which is that there's a whole bunch of guidance for doctors on how to effectively diagnose cancer based on symptoms, biometric, genetic history, etc. That's very complex to navigate. But if you use an algorithm and some predictive analytics, you can basically build a very basic tool to help any general practitioner in the world become almost an expert in early stage cancer diagnosis. And for me, that's incredibly inspiring.
Final question, 10 seconds each. You can answer only yes or no. Do you know what an alfajor is? I talked about that earlier today. Do you know? Yes or no? Yes.
Yes.
No.
No. One alfajor. No. You had.
Yes, but I've yet to try.
3 yes and 2 no's. You now have a chance to taste it. Thank you so much. This was an insightful and sweet conversation.